Good morning and good afternoon, and welcome to the AgriFutures Chicken Meat Program webinar series. Firstly, I would like to acknowledge the First Nations people of Australia as the traditional custodians of the lands and waters on which we live, learn and work. We pay our respects to the past, present and future elders of these nations, and in particular, I'd like to acknowledge the Wiradjuri people of Australia, the traditional custodians of the lands and waters where AgriFutures head office is located, which is Walla Walla, and that's where I'm hosting this webinar from today. So I will do a quick introduction as to who I am very shortly. Just a quick bit of housekeeping first. We will be recording today's session and we will be making that available through online channels. And that recording has already commenced. You do have video and audio functionality enabled, so feel free to keep your video on if you wish and if your bandwidth allows. But we do kindly ask that you keep yourselves on mute to minimise background noise and distractions to our speakers and presenters. We will have time for questions and answers at the conclusion of all the presentations. In the meantime, there is a dedicated Q&A chat function for you to ask any questions over the course of the webinar, and that's located across the top of your screens and close by to the chat function, but not to be confused, because we will be monitoring the Q&A function section only rather than the chat for the questions. And when we do open up the questions, you're more than welcome to unmute yourselves and or raise your hand to ask questions. So, quick welcome to myself. I'm Sarika Pandya. I'm the Research Manager, part of the AgriFutures Levied and Emerging Industries team, and specifically I look after the Chicken Meat RD&E program. And one of the key research priorities within this program focuses on enhancing chicken biosecurity, health and welfare. And the program does invest in research via industry levies within this area, and we want to support our stakeholders to have access to strategies and or tools that support and strengthen industry biosecurity. Now, this webinar is the first in a series in which we host expert presenters to provide you with the latest information on topics that are relevant to the industry, as well as our research priorities. So today's webinar is all about emergency animal disease, or EADs, as you might hear throughout the call, preparedness and biosecurity, and it's designed to share information about preparedness and biosecurity information that's useful to anybody who works in or is involved in the Australian chicken meat industry in a really timely topic at the moment. So today you'll hear presentations from speakers covering the areas of preparing for our Australian risks and where to find our resources, what implementing good biosecurity on farm looks like, as well as accessing a biosecurity risk assessment solution for use on farm. So with that, I will introduce our first speaker, and I'll ask them to kindly start commencing their screen sharing whilst I do this introduction. So our first speaker is Dr. Rob Barwell from Animal Health Australia. Rob is the head of program biosecurity, and he manages livestock biosecurity and animal health projects with that focus on endemic diseases. But has extensive knowledge in the exotic or the emergency animal disease space as well. He's passionate about making positive changes in animal health and welfare on farm, which would benefit Australian livestock industries. Thank you. With that, I'll hand over to Rob.
Thank you, Sarika, and thanks to AgriFutures for having me on the webinar today. So hi everyone. Yes, I look after biosecurity at our programs here at AHA. But before jumping into some information on that, I thought I'd just quickly give some background to who Animal Health Australia, or AHA, is. And apologies if you already know this, but for those that don't, we're an independent, not-for-profit company with funding from both government and industry. Our role is to manage national animal health programs, some with multiple stakeholders and often with different funding sources. And some well-known examples include the Emergency Animal Disease Response Agreement, or the EADRA, and the AUSVETPLAN, Australia's Veterinary Emergencies Plan. AHA also conducts and hosts a range of animal health surveillance and biosecurity projects, and we also conduct emergency animal disease training exercises, courses, and have online resources available. So we have quite a few members there. So we sort of break them up into the different categories of governments. So we have the Commonwealth, state and territory governments in our government membership. We have currently 14 peak industry bodies amongst our livestock members, and that includes the Australian Chicken Meat Federation. We also have associate members such as CSIRO, or the Australian Centre for Disease Preparedness, Wildlife Health Australia, various RDCs, and veterinary and other animal health related peak bodies. And I guess the key factor behind our success is, and the projects that we manage, is the ability to bring all those members together to work in partnerships and enabling the projects and investments and outcomes that we're all working on together. So the ADRA is a formal legal binding document between AHA, all the Australian governments, and the 14 livestock peak industry bodies or signatories. It covers the management and funding of responses and EAD incidents, aiming to reduce the risk of EAD incursions and provide surety to funding cost-shared responses. The ADRA provides clarity around all the signatories' roles, responsibilities and requirements before and during a cost-shared EAD response. It achieves this in part by providing that parties that fund a response to an EAD have a role in decision-making about the response and its funding. This in turn supports Australia to be better prepared, respond rapidly and return to normal as quickly as possible with minimal disruption. And most of the 7 occasions when the ADRA has actually been used over the last couple of decades that it's been in existence have been for responding to poultry emergency animal diseases, notably avian influenza outbreaks, including the current one. The other important program that I mentioned AHA looks after are the AUSVET plans, and they're a series of manuals that set out agreed national policy and guidelines for agencies and organisations involved in a response to an emergency animal disease outbreak. They're made up a series of public documents, so anybody can access these, and the QR code up in the top right corner will lead people to the relevant page where they're all situated. But they provide overview of, so there's an overview manual, EAD response strategies. So for all of the diseases listed under the ADRA, there's a response strategy. We have operational manuals, enterprise manuals, guidance documents, etc. When reading one manual, it's important to realise that they actually work together, and so they kind of read as a suite. And why is AUSVETPLAN so important? As I said, it sets out how Australia will respond to an emergency animal disease, which will in turn lead to a rapid response for that EAD, minimising the time lost during developing policy during the outbreak, and yeah, as I mentioned, the quick return to business. AHA's role is to sort of help facilitate stakeholder engagement and consultation in developing these agreed national response plans. AHA has a role in maintaining these manuals, including periodic updates and the development of new manuals. We always consult with all appropriate stakeholders and involve industry and government members in the review process. AHA doesn't actually set the EAD response policy, but brings together government and industry to help broker that policy. And 2 notable AUSVET plans that I've put there on the screen are the Poultry Industry Enterprise Manual and the Avian Influenza Response Strategy, which has obviously been put into good use recently. And as it says on there at the moment, it's currently under review. So there's a working draft up on the webpage. So the other area that we have a strong focus on, and my normal area of business, is biosecurity. And obviously everyone's heard the catchphrase, biosecurity is a shared responsibility. And I love this image, which those of you that went to PICS will have seen already, but I think it's just great to sort of demonstrate that there's various parts at play here in the system. We've got the Commonwealth doing a great job at the border, trying to keep out EADs. As well as assisting our neighbours deal with them when they arrive there. The states and territories have legislation for biosecurity in place and an active role within their jurisdiction. There's also industry-level biosecurity and surveillance programs that are utilised in the country. And finally, the base of the biosecurity system is the biosecurity on farms around the country. We need every farm and enterprise to have a biosecurity plan as our final level of protection, or most important level of protection. So I guess at its basic form, on-farm biosecurity is risk analysis and the practical measures to address the risks. Every business is different, so it's important that every producer or business owner looks at their own property and flock and identifies the risks for them and implements practical measures to reduce those identified risks. So if that farm biosecurity is implemented, it should in turn lead to increased productivity through endemic disease management, increased profitability as a result, the ability to demonstrate on-farm practices to purchasers of animals and their products, and ongoing surveillance to ensure disease is detected quickly, and obviously the focus here being on emergency animal diseases. And obviously, if any grower is seeing anything unusual signs of disease in their flock, it's really important. If you think it's something like that, please contact your regular vet, your local animal health officer or veterinarian, or the emergency animal disease hotline with the number there in the right corner. Again, just quickly rushing through the biosecurity management plan, which there's some simple steps there to implementing. So basically, it's about determining what the goal is for the property or the enterprise, assessing the risks, what is the likelihood and consequence of a pest, disease, or weed incursion, capture what you already are doing to minimise the risks in the biosecurity plan, create the action plan to prioritise improvements to the biosecurity plan you have, and review your plan at least annually, but more importantly, when risks change, the environment changes. Obviously, at the moment, AI being in several jurisdictions in Australia would be a very timely period to be making sure that biosecurity plans are reflecting this change in risk. There's a lot of different templates and plans available, and some tools obviously that will be talked about by my fellow presenters as well, but I guess essentially it should be including things like a map and the 6 essentials of inputs, people, vehicles, equipment, production practices, dealing with feral animals, pests and weeds, and outputs, as well as how staff are trained and the recording of that plan and all the actions happening within it. Again, my fellow speakers will be concentrating on some of that. And importantly, having an EAD action plan as part of that, and staff being aware of what's required if there is the suspicion or suspected EAD on the farm. And that's just an example of one that's been pulled from a template. So biosecurity resources, where can people find them? Look, obviously a lot of the departments have a lot of good information and resources available on them. So depending on which jurisdiction you're viewing from, it's worth checking out your department website. There's obviously a number of other sites, including one that Animal Health Australia, in collaboration with Plant Health Australia, has had for I think coming up towards 20 years now, the Farm Biosecurity website. It's got a lot of information there for producers and others in the different livestock and plant sectors, including various industry-specific pages that contain things like biosecurity manuals, document templates that people can use, videos on biosecurity. Now, the two most relevant examples of the biosecurity plans I've got on the right there. So the National Farm Biosecurity Manual for chicken growers, which the chicken industry has developed, and as recent recently as 2020 reviewed. So that's a great resource for all growers out there. And another one that's been around for even longer is the National Water Biosecurity Manual for Poultry Production. Has been around for longer, but still a great document to have as a reference point. Another great source of materials, and Sarika hasn't actually prepped me for this one. I found this while I was doing my prep for the presentation. Obviously, the AgriFutures website itself. There's a lot of good stuff on there, with the URL up on the top of the slide there. But you'll find some great resources there if you haven't already come across them. We also have the Chicken Meat Federation's website as well, with some information there and various tools as well, including a link to a training online training course for those that haven't already undertaken it. I know we're focusing on chicken meat today, but it's worth pointing out that Australian Eggs have also developed a lot of tools for the egg industry, and obviously some of these things are potentially relevant as well for chicken meat growers. So worth having a look there if you haven't already come across their website and the tools there. Some of them are members only, but some of them are freely available. Oops. So some other AHA resources, we have some very high level online courses that anyone can do, looking at how a response might work and how, I guess, the general animal health and biosecurity system works, particularly in regards to EAD responses. The QR code there is a link to the relevant page. Anyone can register and use those courses. They also form part of the National Biosecurity Training Hub now. So that's a collaboration of various entities putting together all of the training resources in this space. And for anyone wanting updates on what's happening with the avian influenza situation, obviously there's quite a few people circulating them, but AHA has a dedicated web page on that particular disease and the response for it. So I guess in summary, yeah, everyone has a part to play in biosecurity. Disease incursions like to find the weakest link in the system, so it's important that we all do our bit. Having a biosecurity plan is important to help prevent pests, weeds and diseases from entering, spreading within and exiting a flock or enterprise. There are a lot of EAD preparedness and biosecurity resources available for industries to use, including some more that will be mentioned in the next couple of presentations. And the better the biosecurity planning and preparedness, the more likely a disease outbreak will be mitigated sooner and a return to normal business will occur. And with that, I'll say thank you and happy to answer some questions after the other two presenters have given their presentation.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for that, Rob. And just a reminder to everybody on the call that there is the Q&A chat function. So if you don't want to hold your questions to the end, feel free to put them there in that feature. Now, in the meantime, I'll provide you an introduction to our second speaker, which is Rod Jenner. Rod, I'll just kindly ask that you start sharing your screen whilst I go through the introduction. So Rod is, and probably well known to a lot of people here on this call, but Rod is a poultry veterinarian and he owns and manages his own consultancy to the chicken meat and egg industries, as well as allied organisations. And Rod has regularly engaged with AgriFutures Australia as well as Australian Eggs to conduct projects of national significance. And these projects have spanned the areas of animal welfare, antimicrobial stewardship, and things like genetics and food safety, but more importantly, exotic and emergency disease mitigation. I'll hand over to Rod, to talk to a little bit more about what does good biosecurity or implementing biosecurity on farm look like. Thank you very much, Rod.
Thanks, Sarika, and welcome to everybody, and thanks for the opportunity to talk to you today. So what I'm going to talk to you about is how an EAD response may happen in practice on your farm, highlighting the significance of preparedness for a response, and also highlighting the importance that it is that we maintain a good biosecurity system in practice on farm, as well as following industry guidelines. Rob gave a really good introduction there to the guidelines and the information and all the data, AHA and industry type books and guidelines that you can source and access. But the important thing is that as a producer, that you actually put these things in practice. And this is where I'm going to talk to you today about, is actually putting these things in practice, because that's where the crunch is, where the rubber hits the road, I guess, when something happens. So in the event of an EAD on a property, this is what happens to your head. It is so mind-boggling. There are so many things happening, so many decisions being made, so much instruction being given. There's a lot of things to try and grasp and comprehend in a very, very short space of time. It's coming from lots and lots of different directions. So with the guidelines, with a biosecurity response plan, what we're trying to do is to put some order into all this, so that everything is done in a consequential manner, everything is done in a logical manner, and we get ourselves out of the dilemma and back into business as quickly as possible. So it is really important that we have a good grasp on what a response looks like, and a good grasp on how we can implement activities and processes on farm to get ourselves out of an EAD and back to normal business as quickly as possible. So what happens on the farm during an EAD? Obviously, the first instance is that you suspect a disease on your farm and you notify someone. That's a very important thing. And as Rob mentioned, it's really important to get that done early and quickly. So as a producer, you're the eyes and the ears of the disease status of your farm, and you are the first people to identify that there may be something wrong. We don't need to get you to diagnose a problem. We need you to identify that there may be something wrong on your farm, and you tell somebody. Now, if you bring someone on the farm, a veterinarian, who suspects that you may have an EAD, there is a process in play. Veterinarians have an obligation to advise their state chief veterinary officer if they suspect an EAD is starting, and the immediate response is to put your property on a standstill. That means that there's no movements on or off the property, whether you be a broiler farmer or an egg producer. There is no movement. So the gate is locked. There's just an absolute standstill. And that standstill stays in place until a decision is made on whether or not an EAD is on the property, and a laboratory confirmation is made. Now, in addition to that standstill, there's quarantine requirements. So if you do need to move things off a property under instruction at this stage, as I mentioned there, it's the CVO who has control on suspicion of an EAD. Your state CVO has that control. So anything that needs to move off that farm or move onto the farm is at the whim and under the control of your CVO. And it is very, very strict. Remember that the priority of the state departments of agriculture and your biosecurity departments is to control and eradicate an exotic or an emergency animal disease. If that means that there is collateral damage, if that means that your property is sacrificed in some way, that will be done. That will happen. So if an EAD is diagnosed on your property, quarantine is immediately enforced. There is a lot of surveillance done in the interim to try and trace where this disease has come from and where it may go. And then we wait for instruction from the CVO in terms of how the response is activated. So essentially, that's the flow of activities if you get an EAD diagnosed on your property. So the important thing that we're talking about today is getting good preparation in place in the event that an EAD may occur. And Rob mentioned this as well. Good preparation means that we have a faster response to the crisis. A quicker response means we'll get a quicker cleanup, quicker recovery, and return to business as usual faster. So it is important that at farm level, at the property level, you have really good preparation in place to assist the authorities to undertake the eradication response. It's important to think of it as assisting the authorities because they will have control. There is no pushback, there is no debate in these issues. It is in your best interest to assist the departments to move forward as quickly as possible on these responses. So it's important that we have this shared responsibility towards both prevention and response. So if you are the infected property in that outbreak, this is what happens to your property. 3 things: destruction, so all of the susceptible animals on your property are euthanized as soon as possible. And then they're disposed of in a biosecure manner. So it's about removing any infected material from any risk of transmission to other properties. That's the bottom line of it. So disposing of all dead birds, manure, litter, feed, eggs, packaging, anything that can be disposed of will be disposed of by various methods, which will be decided in the most biosecure manner. It may be by deep burial, it may be by composting, it may be on your farm, it may be off-site. And it is a very high biosecurity practice. And then the entire site is decontaminated, dismantled, washed and disinfected. The farm is left empty after that time, and it may be up to 28 days after the outbreak is contained. Not necessarily after your farm is empty, but after the outbreak is contained, at which time it may be restocked with sentinel birds or restocked with commercial flocks if the sentinels remain negative. This could take up to 3 to 4 months, so it's a lengthy process. And again, as I mentioned earlier, it's really important that we do this as quickly as possible so that we can get our businesses back up and running as quickly as possible. Now, you would have seen in the current outbreaks that we've got that around the infected property, we have an area called a restricted area, which is under really tight control. And every property inside that restricted area will be classified in some way because they are considered as a high-risk property. So you'll be declared as a suspect property, trace property, dangerous contact property, or an infected property. There are some other classifications depending on what the risk your property is in terms of being infected from the initial infected property. If during surveillance and monitoring of that flock, your birds show a positive result, those birds will be euthanized and you'll become an infected property, an IP, and then go through the 3D process: destruction, disposal, and decontamination. If you're negative, the birds may be processed under very, very strict criteria, more than likely not, because the risk of moving broilers out of a restricted area to a processing plant is very high in terms of transmitting or shedding the virus and contaminating the environment and potentially spreading it to other farms. So very, very unlikely to move birds out of a restricted area to a processing plant for slaughter. And as I said there, the farm will not be restocked. Even if you're not an infected property, it's unlikely that you'll receive day-old chicks during an outbreak. So there is no likelihood of bringing risk species back into a restricted area during an outbreak scenario. Outside the restricted area is a control area, which is a much wider area. In the Victorian case, I believe it was an area of about 20 by 30 kilometres. And that is also a very strict movement control region. So you'll only be able to move animals, livestock, feed, etc. under permit at that point. And there will be active surveillance going on in that zone. Again, if the birds are negative, they may be processed under strict movement criteria. If positive, the farm will be declared an IP and a restricted area will be put around that infected property, and then the whole process around an RA will continue. And again, in a control area, suspect livestock, as in chicks, will more than likely not be allowed back onto that control area until the outbreak has been contained and declared free. Now, all these decisions are up to the individual state CVO, so it may be slightly different depending on what state you're in. So what I'm suggesting here is not cut and dried, and it does depend entirely on the risk profile and the surveillance activities around the current outbreak. Okay, so that's the process that has occurred in Victoria and in New South Wales around the current outbreaks that we have. Now, Rob spoke extensively about farm biosecurity plans, which are really, really important. But what is a plan? Okay, Rob showed us a pyramid there, and across the bottom was every farm should have a biosecurity plan. Well, I think there should be another line under that every property should have biosecurity activities ongoing on a daily basis. Those plans have to be put in place. It's no good having a plan or a document sitting on a shelf somewhere saying we will do this, we will do that, without actually doing it. And it is really, really important that you have active biosecurity in place on your property to ensure that we don't get exposure to the avian influenza virus. I believe you'd all understand that we have virus in our wild birds. That's a known fact. Our wild waterfowl in Australia do carry the virus, and the current outbreaks that we're facing in Victoria and New South Wales have been a spillover event from wild birds to commercial poultry. The risk to us, what I'm going to do today is talk about two key focus points. Wild waterfowl, they're by far our biggest risk, without a doubt. Because, as I said, they're carrying the virus, and if there's any contamination of waterways or range areas around feed silos or anything like that, the risk of introducing avian influenza virus into our flocks is much, much higher. So if you're doing nothing else, get nothing else out of today, please think about the wild waterfowl that can be contaminating your environment, your biosecurity zone around your property, and how to minimise or eliminate the risk of virus coming from those birds into your commercial poultry. Okay, that's number one, biosecurity risk in terms of avian influenza. So what happens, these wild waterfowl carrying the virus, they will shed the virus in their manure. Now that manure can contaminate the immediate area. So that could be around your pads, around your silos, around your water tanks, or around your personnel doors, and this sort of thing. They can contaminate that immediate area, or they can contaminate your water supplies if you have surface water on your property. And then that virus can be carried into the shed directly on your boots, or on a vehicle, on some wheels, or via the water into your shed, or via the wind. So your biosecurity plan, and which is basically your approach to controlling wild waterfowl exposure, must prevent all of these entry points. It must. There's no two ways about it. It has to. So the direct entry points, walked in on boots, for example, driven in on vehicles. So if you're taking vehicles into your sheds to turn the litter, that's a high-risk activity. Can be carried in by rodents physically. The rodents will nest and burrow outside the sheds, running around amongst the manure. They can bring that into the sheds. Other domestic animals, similarly, dogs and cats, dogs and pet cats, wild animals, wild entry of feral animals, or wild birds entering your sheds. Okay, all very, very important points. The indirect entry points are just as important. Now, when I say water, that's not just drinking water. That also includes cooling pad water, for example. Thinking about duck behaviour, and this is where we need to think actively about how the risks might occur. Wood ducks graze on the grass, seed heads, and other herbage. So if you've got grass that carries seed heads on a range area, you're going to be introducing a feed source for wood ducks. And they'll come in at night time, they'll graze in your range areas, leave their droppings behind. You let your chickens out in the morning. Chickens like the look of duck droppings and they will eat them. So there's a real risk there just from the type of grass and the length of the grass that you have on your range areas in terms of wood ducks being attracted to them. Pacific black ducks graze on the dam vegetation, so they're more of a water source risk, and they will eat the algae and eat the vegetation around your dam. So Pacific black ducks particularly will accumulate on your dams. They often feed at night time. They don't travel overseas, so this is a local Australian issue. They're nomadic. But when I say nomadic, if you have a look at this picture here, this diagram, this was some grey teal ducks that were tagged in Darwin, and in 17 days they were recaught in various locations, and you can see that grey teal ducks will travel the entire length and breadth of Australia in a very, very short space of time. You see only 17 days. So imagine how far they go in a season. So, and pinpointing Darwin, that's very close to, obviously, to Papua New Guinea, Indonesia, those areas where we know that the H5N1 virus is probably floating around in the wild bird populations up there. So it is a real risk in terms of our commercial poultry. The wild waterfowl can bring these viruses directly to our farms. The other risk that I believe is very, very important to us is movement on and off your farms. So the wild birds is one issue you need to address. The other issue you need to address is the risk of physical movement of the virus on equipment, on people, into your property. And this is how virus has spread in the current outbreaks. It has actually spread on eggs, it's spread on equipment from farm to farm. So it's a real fact and a real risk area for us. Lots of movements onto your farm. So again, with your biosecurity plan, you must think about every movement onto your farm and think about the essential ones, right? And how you can allow essential movements onto your farm in a biosecure manner. It's no good saying, well, we've got to bring the chicks onto the farm. Well, it's a biosecurity gap. We'll bring it on anyway. We need to think how we can move these things onto your farm in a biosecure manner so that you're eliminating that risk of anything that comes onto your farm from carrying the virus with it. Just a point on the traceback surveillance. This is a critical factor when you're thinking about the biosecurity and the movements around your farm. During the traceback surveillance, if the department pinpoints your farm as an infected property, and they pinpoint today as the day that they believe the infection got onto your property, the day that the infection is diagnosed on your property, we need to go back at least 14 days to try and identify if there has been an entry from another property in that 14-day period. So surveillance necessarily requires traceback for up to 14 days onto your property. It's really important to be able to identify this because we're looking at the initial source of the infection to that property. It may be on another farm somewhere, and if we don't pick it up early, we get these diseases spreading before we can get in front of them. We end up with more than one infected property. So it's really important to be able to have good traceback data, traceback information, and that will lead into the next talk by Chris Atkins in terms of visitor and movement records, because it is really important to be able to trace movements on and off your property very, very accurately. It's well known impossible to remember every movement onto your property or off your property in the heat of the moment when you're really, really under a lot of stress. So movement records are quite vital information in order to be able to get some clarity around the risks in terms of where this disease may have come from onto your property. Like I said, it's not always wild birds. It may be a movement of a feed truck. It may be a movement of a dead bird truck or something like that that's come onto your farm 12 days ago. And so it's important that the authorities are able to go back and try and identify those risk areas and do active surveillance and active monitoring at all of those risk areas in order to trace the disease and get on top of it very, very quickly. Good visitor records are important. I mentioned earlier that we need to help the authorities to eradicate this disease. So we can help yourself and improve the response time by helping the incident controllers and the department who are trying to eradicate this disease by providing accurate information and timely information. If you don't have that good information, unfortunately, they can't really pinpoint where it may have come from, and they tend to throw a wider blanket over the whole farming operation, the farming enterprise, the number of farms, in order to do more active farm surveillance if they can't eliminate farms as being out of the risk zones. So it is, by having poor records, you're actually increasing the umbrella, I guess, of the restricted area and controlled area potentially, and slowing down the response time. So some of the practical steps on farm for movement controls: restricting visitors into production areas and sheds to essential people only, having shed boots and footpaths at every entrance, hand wash facilities, don't share staff or equipment between farms. If you do have people coming onto your farm that must come onto the farm to supply equipment, to supply birds, to supply feed, you really need to understand how much of a risk they are. So putting some sort of a supplier arrangement in place, ensuring that your suppliers understand their biosecurity requirements, their truck washing requirements, the restrictions from being on other farms, that sort of thing. It's really important that you understand and have a good working relationship with all of these people that are potentially bringing disease onto your farm, so that you can be comfortable and have an assurance that your suppliers aren't going to bring disease onto your farm. In addition, sanitising anything that does come onto the farm, equipment, people, vehicles that come onto your farm. You really need to have some method of being able to sanitise those vehicles onto your farm and off your farm again. Farm gate controls, locking the gate, entry signs, QR codes, visitor parking away from the entry area. Again, try to minimise every time you eliminate an entry onto the farm, you're improving your biosecurity. So it is important that you minimise the number of entries and try and restrict it to essential people only. And then back into the actual production area or into the shed itself, much tighter biosecurity again. It's always safe to assume, a safe practice to assume that whoever might be walking into your sheds could well be carrying the virus with them. So what are you going to put in place to ensure that that person that is walking into your shed is not bringing virus with them? I know it's probably not a good thought, but you probably shouldn't be trusting anybody in this situation. It is just far too important and far too critical to you, the health of your flocks and the health of your business, to not put any trust in anyone that you don't have a good understanding of their understanding of biosecurity. Entry procedures for vehicles and equipment, minimise the entries. That's the best way. Don't let people on that don't need to come on. Sanitise wheels and wheel wells as a minimum. As you can see there, the picture of the truck there with the wheel wash. It's better than nothing. It's not ideal, but it is far better than nothing. Remember to sanitise cabs. Footwells are really high contamination zones, because that's where your dirty boots will deposit manure from a previous farm, and then you drag it out and you hop out of the vehicle the next time. So it's important to think about that process when you're bringing people or equipment or vehicles onto your farms. Control methods for wild waterfowl. Think about this. What is going to attract birds to your farm? What can I do to stop attracting birds to the farm? And here's some of the things that we put in place routinely to discourage birds from coming around your sheds. You can see a couple of pictures there of birds sitting on a roof of a shed, perched up there quite happily. You can see a feed spill under a silo there with lots and lots of droppings. So you're attracting birds straight to the sheds by having feed spills and not cleaning them up after you. Controls around dams have always been a problem. It's hard to find successful methods for keeping birds off dams. Some of the later things I've been seeing are lasers targeting wild birds. Drones have been used, and you can get bird deterrent drones. If you Google it, they are out there. They're used around airports, for example. They're used a lot around horticulture to discourage birds from eating grain and flying into crops. So they are available. It's quite simple to Google them and you'll find them. Simple things that you can do around dams is netting them or stringing flags across the dam. I've seen that being quite successful. And what you're doing there is interrupting the landing pattern of the ducks. If they have to, if you watch a duck fly into a dam, they'll glide into a dam. If there's strings across the dam with flags and things, they're distracted from it and they choose not to land there. So simple things like that you can do, which are quite successful in terms of keeping birds off your waterways. Obviously not having any surface water on the dam, any surface water on your property if you don't need it is a really good option as well. Do you really need to have that dam on your property? Do you have standing water during rain events? Should you improve your drainage around your sheds? Those sort of things. So they're all really important things. Keeping your entry pad area clean is another really important area because that's where vehicles will travel as they're going into the shed. So you need to not allow waterfowl to hang around your pads, hang around your personnel doors. If you keep those nice and bare and clean and barren, there's no need for the waterfowl to hang around there. Water, a pretty obvious one. We need to treat our water, any water going into the shed, drinking water and cooling water. You need to be able to monitor that water and it needs to be continuous. It's no good having chlorination sometimes and not other times. You must have it continuously treated and being able to monitor that treatment constantly. And if you do have faults, repair them immediately. You can see a water tank there on the bottom picture, the lid left off the medication tank. Well, that's not a closed water system. Now, that might be bore water going directly into the sheds, but if you've got the lid off the water tank, that's no longer a closed system and you're risking your flocks by leaving that lid off that tank. Dead bird handling is something which gets highlighted as an issue, which we sometimes don't think about. If you've got vehicles turning up to your property to pick up your dead birds, it's important to understand where they've come from because obviously dead birds are higher risk of carrying disease. So if we can reduce the number of pickups by chilling, freezing carcasses, composting, rendering, burying on site, all those sort of things reduce the risk of a vehicle bringing dead birds onto your site and bringing infection with them. If you do have a dead bird handling process, picking up the farm boundary away from any thoroughfares is a really important point so that you're not contaminating your farm entries with a dead bird truck that's potentially dropping any sort of residue or dropping dead dirty bins outside your gate and that sort of thing, and then leaving behind any dead bird residue from other farms. So that's an important area that is sometimes neglected and I think needs a little bit more focus. And the other thing is catching crews. Now, we're in the business of growing chickens, so you've got to have catching crews coming onto your farm. We can't get away from it. So it's always a really difficult one to manage in terms of biosecurity. It is a necessary part of our chicken farming. So it's really important that the process is working closely with the catching teams, with the catching integrators, whoever you might be using, to ensure that you do have good movement controls built into the catching crew movements, keeping good records, being very careful about the order of farm pickups, perhaps trying to compartmentalise your regions so that if there is any disease spreading between catching crews, it's not being spread across a whole region. It may be kept into smaller regions, ensuring that the staff that are coming with the catching crews are up to speed on what their biosecurity requirements are. You have good PPE, good boot washing and that sort of thing coming into the shed. So even though it's necessary and it is a really high biosecurity risk time, there are things that you can do to minimise the risks from catching crews coming onto your farms. So I've tried to sort of bring it into a nutshell and pull it all together very quickly for you. Obviously, there's a lot more things that are important, but I think the ones that I've mentioned here, I think are probably the highest critical points that really must be considered when you're putting plans in place. And that's all I've got. Thanks, Sarika.
Thank you very much, Rod. And throughout that presentation, I think you picked up on a key aspect which our next speaker will speak to a little bit more. So our final speaker for today is Chris Aitken from ExoFlare. Chris is the Chief Operations Officer and has got a wide breadth of experience in Australia and overseas in many technological companies, startups, and in the ag industry and several other non-ag related industries. And Chris has been working very closely with the Chicken Meat Program over the past 2 years to develop a risk assessment solution for use on farm to provide real-time risk assessment of visitors. So with that, I'll hand over to Chris for the last presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarika, and thanks, everybody. Sarika, is my screen sharing working? Can you see the slides?
Yep. Yes, it is, Chris.
Yep, brilliant. So thanks for that. So just to recap briefly, Rob was talking about all of the great resources that are out there to help you understand how to optimize and perform biosecurity tasks to minimize the risks. Rod talked about a number of different ways, both in terms of waterfowl, but also particularly around movement controls. And what I'm going to show you is a solution that we've built to help you with those movement controls. So I work with a company called ExoFlare. We've been working with the chicken meat industry and eggs and pork and a number of others now for the last couple of years. And our whole philosophy is around stopping risks before they cross your farm gate. And the way that we've done that is we've built something that codifies the biosecurity logic of each of your specific commodities. So whether you're a chicken meat farm, whether you're an egg farm, whether you're a duck farm, whether you're pork, etc. And what we've done is create something that drives higher consistency of decision making in the moment when someone is about to enter your property. So we're giving you a tool that will create the records that Rod was talking about, that will in effect codify the logic that Rob was referencing from all the great work that AHA has done. And I'll show you very, very quickly how that works. So once you sign up for the product, you're then attaching a QR code sign onto every gate. And then you're directing all visitors and drivers to sign in using that QR code. What they're doing in that moment then is they're completing a biosecurity risk assessment, and we're then applying the rules both from the biosecurity manuals and from additional things that your company has codified to then determine do they represent a high risk or a low risk entry. If they're a low risk entry, you can configure it that they're then automatically allowed onto the property. You'll receive a notification advising that Chris has arrived at your farm and he's a low risk visitor. If, however, they're a high risk visitor, what then happens is the visitor is then told to stop, to not enter the property and wait for further instructions. And then the person who they were coming to see, their host on site, receives an immediate notification saying that Chris is at your farm gate and he's representing high risk. And then you get given guidance on how to make a decision, and then that decision gets written in. The first step is to recognize that the biosecurity laws in each state are a little different. So we've designed these check-in signs so that they are state specific. In this example, it happens to be New South Wales. But the language on the sign is state specific and thus provides you with access to the protection under the Biosecurity Act. When you scan that code, you're then presented with a choice to indicate your role. So whether it's delivery and transport, whether it's visitor, and shortly we're about to relaunch an employee and contractor option. What then happens is once you click that, you're providing your contact information if we don't already have it, and then you're clicking a link to start the biosecurity assessment. And what's happening in that instance and what makes this particularly powerful is that we're aware of all the other sites that you've been to based on the sites that we're protecting. So in this particular example, we're already highlighting that this visitor who's seeking to come on site has been in other locations within the last 72 hours, but that other location does not violate the quarantine rules of the site that they're seeking to enter. And I'll show you a little bit more about how we do that in a minute. You then get asked, depending on the commodity, between 3 and 7 additional questions that cover the usual things that you would expect that relate to quarantine matrices, that relate to overseas travel, health issues, your family members or household members, etc. And what happens is, as you're going through and answering those questions, you're being assessed in real time. And then what happens is, in this particular case, I've indicated that I've come in through, I've been in touch with another site. And so thus I'm being told I have to wait. What then happens is the person who is my host is then been given the notification, comes in and is given information about all of the low risk as well as high risk answers. And then that person is making a decision. So they can choose to allow entry or they can choose to deny entry. Either way, what then happens is that they're then asked to include some free text responses which become part of the record around why they made that decision. So they might say that it's an essential worker, they're going to clean their equipment and they're going to leave their vehicle outside the farm, or whatever the reason is to allow this high risk person onto site. All of those records then get written to the equivalent of a digital visitor log. So what this is allowing you to do is then trace whether it's a delivery driver or a visitor coming on site, the company they represent, the reasons why they're on site, which site, when they checked in and out, if there are high risk responses, what they are, other locations they've been. And you can see here that we delineate between your own sites. So here we're sort of showing that this person has been on one of your other sites, farm 1 or farm 3, versus we protect the privacy of the person coming on site. If it's not one of your sites, we tell you they've been on an external chicken farm. We don't tell you which one. But this gives you the information you then need to make a decision about whether you want to allow that person to come onto the site or not. And one of the things that's really important is that that information is in a structured form that you can filter and that you can do analysis with as you need to help drive your own business. And then, as Rod was saying, in an EAD situation, the ability to quickly, through this download button, bring the data down and then provide the appropriate, whether it's 14 days or 21 days or 30 days, going back to then help the authorities do what they need to do. But at all times, you remain in control of your data. We're not surveilling you. We're not giving anything to the government. It's your data. You control it. And then you control who gets access to it and when and under what circumstances. And one of the things that's powerful is the ability to, in effect, codify your quarantine matrices. So the ability to control when you're going from a chicken rearing breeder to another breeder, for example, or when you're going from a broiler to a broiler, you can set what those requirements are, and then you can override them if there are site-specific rules. And what that means is that you're getting much more consistency in decision-making. It also means that when you get an outbreak like we did in AI, the organizations that are already using this immediately modified their quarantine rules to then start to lift their biosecurity defenses further, given what was happening. And in that unfortunate situation, what we actually did was we contacted everybody on the day that this became public. And the following day we had, we expanded our declared risk area question to explicitly link to AgVix information. And then unfortunately, when it became in Sydney and Canberra, we then link out and expand that as well. So we're monitoring all of these outbreaks, and we're making sure that for your commodity, for visitors coming onto your site, the people who are responding are being given the information to make sure that they can help you make the right decision about entry or not. Once you have that sort of digital visitor log, not only can you then be sure that you've got records that can help you get back to business as usual, but it also gives you a way of understanding what decisions are your team making. So, for example, these are the classes of questions around quarantine matrices, around animal contact, health status, etc. In this particular example, you can see there are a number of people that were rated as high risk who were then allowed entry. And that might cause you to wonder, well, why was that the case? And so then I started talking about earlier that you then provide that free text reason as to why they're allowed on entry. And then people will provide whatever the answers are that make sense, some of which you'll agree with, others which you won't. But the important thing is you're then able to have targeted conversations around the process, the training and communications of your teams and of other people coming on sites. And then finally, the other thing that we can then do with this is we can then begin to map where you're getting quarantine and other high-risk movements. So the blue dots here represent a series of farms that belong to one organization. The greens are another, the browns are another, etc. And what you can start to see is not only risks going on between your own system, but then risks crossing systems. And so what that gives you is an ability to then have conversations where you're looking at your the partners and other folks who are coming on and off your properties and making sure that they're respecting the quarantine rules that are required from each of that. So I've gone through that very quickly. I'll turn it over not just to questions on me, but questions for the whole broad panel that we've got here today. So Sarika, I'll hand it back to you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for that, Chris. And before I move into the Q&A, I do appreciate that we have gone a little bit over the allocated time of 12 o'clock. So if anybody does need to drop off, we will continue to record this little Q&A session as well. Before I open up out to the group for questions, we do have a couple that have been put into the chat, so I might direct those to members or our speakers. So the first question is about farms in a control area which can't restock for a substantial period of time. Question related to that is there any compensation available? And I may direct this one to Rod and Rob.
Yeah, sure. Rob, would you like to respond first, or do I need to?
Rod, happy for you to jump in on this one.
Okay. So compensation is defined under the EADRA, or the Emergency Animal Disease Response Agreement. There is compensation available for loss during an outbreak in terms of stock losses, equipment losses, damage to equipment, and restocking costs for the person who owns the stock. There's no compensation available for consequential loss under the EADRA. So that's the position that it is. So a farm that's in a control area that may not be restocked during an outbreak is not able to resource compensation under the EADRA, but you may be able to resource compensation under your state emergency disaster arrangements, depending on which state you are. There may be financial hardship opportunities there, but you'd have to go through your state department to access that sort of compensation. But under the EADRA, there's no compensation apart for the loss of livestock, feed, equipment, damage to equipment, cost of restocking, etc., for the owner of the animals.
Thanks very much, Rod. And we've got the other question that we've got in our chat directed to Rob, but Rod, you may also, through your experience, be able to respond to this one. It's about how can chlorinated water protect birds if they're infected outside while roaming?
Yeah, thanks, Oric, for that question. It's important that the only water the birds can access is your chlorinated water. So in saying that, birds ranging outside, broilers ranging outside, really shouldn't have access to drinking water. If you have puddles or ponding in your range areas, you really need to manage that so that it's not sitting there, it's running off and you've got good drainage around your range areas. So I think that's how we're trying to manage that exposure of virus coming from any water source, is to ensure that the only water that your birds have access to is chlorinated water. I know that when you've got rain events that you may have pooling water or ponding water, but you really need to have good drainage to not allow that water to be standing there and attracting wild birds to it.
Thanks, Rod. Couldn't have answered it any better.
Thank you very much. And I'll throw out to the rest of the group that are still on this call. If anybody does have any questions, feel free to take yourself off mute, raise a hand. Otherwise, if not, I'll take the silence for the presentations have provided a fair bit of information and maybe answered any budding questions. In in closing, I'd like to quickly bring your attention to a survey that can be accessed via scanning the QR code on your screen, or it's been popped into the chat, not the Q&A, just the chat for this webinar. We'd greatly appreciate your time in providing any feedback so that we can make sure that we can make improvements for any upcoming webinars part of the series. And I'd like to extend a big thank you to our speakers today, and we really appreciate your time and generosity in sharing your knowledge, and thank you to our audience and everybody that has registered and joined today. As you mentioned at the start, the webinar has been recorded. It will be made available in due course after today, and we'll do our best to pull together any resources or items mentioned during the webinar which are of interest in the industry. Just a few other quick reminders to report anything unusual or any concerns about potential EADs to the EAD hotline. And there is an online course which is called Introduction to Farm Biosecurity for Chicken Growers, and that's accessible online, which is designed to serve as an introduction